Now let's talk about the method you use and whether it matches the desired response format. And that's kind of the key thing we're going to talk about here is the response format. So you're going to learn here how to make that match between the method and the response format. Again, in the DBI framework, this is part of your adaptation. So one thing you can think about is whether or not you're using a variety of methods to elicit responses that give you a variety of response formats. What do we mean here by response formats? In terms of match desired response format, we mean basically verbal, written, and physical kinds of responses. And there are two kind of key points here. One, you need to decide which one you're looking for. And two, you need to use a variety of these because all three can be really beneficial to students. So these are pretty obvious what we mean by these. Thinking for yourself, stop and jot. What's an example of a question or instruction you may give, or a question you may ask, or an instruction you may give to elicit a response using each type of response format in your own classroom? Think of one that you've taught recently, or if you haven't taught yet, one that you intend to teach in the future. So think about that, write those down, and then come on back. Okay, now let's have a chance to look at an example. So in this example, we're going to see Ms. Pollock, a fourth grade teacher, our lead teacher here, teaching a lesson on arrays. And what we want to think about here is that, one, whether Ms. Pollock uses a variety of response formats, and two, whether or not she's purposeful in being sure that students are using the response format that she intends. And so you'll see whether or not she does both of those things. So go ahead and watch Ms. Pollock, and then we'll come back together and briefly discuss it. So enjoy.
Today, we're going to be talking about this array. What are we going to be talking about, everyone? This array. Very good. And this array has several squares on it. You can see here. We are going to try to figure out how we can use the rows to figure out how many squares there are all together in the array. Let's think about our first question here. How many rows are there in the array? Show me on your fingers. Good job. There are 4 rows in this array. Let's point to them together. 1, 2, 3, and 4. There are 4 rows in this array. How many squares are in the first row? Here's the first row. How many squares? Show me on your fingers. 3. Great job. There are 3 squares in this row. Let's count them together. 1, 2, 3. There are 3 squares in the first row. How many squares are in the second row, Jocelyn? Great, there are 3 squares in the second row. Thank you for telling me that out loud. How many squares in the third row, Roman? 3. You're right, there are 3 squares in the third row. And how many squares are in the fourth row, Teresa? Come on up and point to each square in the fourth row so we can figure it out. 1, 2, 3. There are 3 squares in the fourth row. Very good. So everyone, all of the rows have how many squares? 3. Very good. All of the rows have 3 squares. I'd like you to whisper to your partner to finish this sentence. There are 3 squares, blank, blank, row. Actually, to fill in the sentence, not to finish it. Go ahead and whisper to your partner. I heard lots of good discussion happening. Sarah Ann, what did you and Dominique say? Great job. You said there are 3 squares in each row. That's right. So everyone, please take out your notebook and copy this down with me. There are 3 squares in each row. Little hint between you and me. I want students to use whiteboards to respond today. I'm going to do my best to make sure that they respond using that response format. Let's see how I do. And go. Today, we're going to be learning about this array. What will we be learning about? Please use your whiteboard to respond. You should have written down array. We will be learning about this array. Now, we want to figure out how many squares there are altogether in this array by using the rows. Here is a row. So, how many rows are there in this array? Ooh, Sally, we're using our whiteboards today. Please write down how many rows you think there are in this array. Go ahead and show me your whiteboard. Good, you should have written down 4. There are 4 rows in this array. Let's look at them together. 1, 2, 3, and 4. There are 4 rows in this array. How many squares are in the first row? Here's the first row. How many squares are in the first row? Damien, keeping our voices off today. We're using our whiteboards. So you need to write down the number. You should have written down that there are 3 squares. Please show me your whiteboard if you didn't already. Good, there are 3 squares in the first row. I'll point to them. 1, 2, 3. There are 3 squares in the first row. How many squares are in the second row, Jocelyn? Write it down, please. Good, I like the way you wrote down that there are 3 squares in the second row. 1, 2, 3. Micah, how many squares are there in the third row? Please write it down. I know you want to share out, but we're using our whiteboards today. There are 3 squares, you're right, in the third row. 1, 2, 3. And everyone, let's say this all together. How many squares are there in the fourth row? You should have said 3. I saw some of you going to use those whiteboards, but I wanted you to respond all together for that one. There are 3 squares in the fourth row. 1, 2, 3. So all of the rows have how many squares, everyone? Oops, make sure you write that on your whiteboard. We're not saying it out loud. 3, that's right. All of the rows have 3 squares. Whisper to your partner to finish this sentence. There are 3 squares, blank, blank row. All right, now everyone please write down what you had in your conversations, what you said in your conversations in the blank spaces in your notebook. All right, let's bring it back together. You should have written down there are 3 squares in each row. If you didn't write that down, please erase what you had and write down my answer that's on the board.
Okay, so you've had a chance to watch Ms. Pollock's video. What I hope you notice with her thought bubbles is that she had a plan for the kind of responses she wanted to elicit. In one example, she was very clear when she spoke to the students about how they would actually elicit a response. She would get them to respond in the correct response format. In the other example, you saw that she was not clear and it did not give her what she wanted. So it's really critical there that you see is that Ms. Pollock really worked hard to, in the one positive case, make sure that she was strategic about getting students to respond the way that she wanted. And I think that one of the things I often notice in classrooms is that teachers aren't sufficiently strategic about thinking, how do I want students to do it? And I've done this in my own classroom. The result is that a lesson doesn't go as well as you want because you haven't thought through what's the way I'm going to get students to actually do this. So you see her do a good job of that. You also see her use a variety of response formats in the good example there. And that's really valuable too because students aren't just seeing things one way, they have the opportunities to do things in multiple ways. So here's a curriculum example. This is something we took from the National Center for Intensive Intervention website. This is for a curriculum we're calling Beginning Numbers. And for this example, you can see that there are a variety of response formats here. So make your whiteboard match mine. That's a written activity. What number? The students say it. That's 6, that's a spoken, that's a verbal response. Here you see another verbal response, a written response that goes along with a gesture response, pointing to the number, and then circling it, and then erasing here at the bottom. So there are a variety of response formats that are helping move the lesson along and getting students engaged in a variety of ways. It's also really clear here that the people who wrote this curriculum had thought strategically about how they would sequence these and how students would do it. I even think it's worth remembering that the teachers had, that the curriculum was designed to have the whiteboard be erased and then to be erased at the beginning and then erased again at the end. That's important because what that shows is that they're thinking about the entire lesson and not just part of it. And that they're trying to make sure that they get the students to respond in exactly the way that they want. This is part of that idea of keeping yourself focused on how to create a lesson, not just how to collect the materials, but how to cognitively process for yourself what the lesson needs to be like. And a lot of times we find is that doesn't happen and the lesson doesn't go as planned. You also find that a lot of curricula don't do this anyway. This is a great example of a curriculum that does provide that level of support. But often curricula just assume you figured out for yourself how students will respond and how the sequence of responses will go and when you'll do gestures and when you'll do verbal responses and so on. Most curricula aren't like this, and that creates a real challenge for you when you have to design your lessons as the curriculum is underspecified. So, speaking of curriculum that you need to evaluate, now it's your turn to look at the curriculum that we've given you as an example. So review the next section of the lesson plan that's written there, and then underline the ways the teachers will elicit a response and identify whether or not the type of response format. And you can decide here whether or not this curriculum is adequate in doing that or not. So go ahead and stop the video, analyze that example, and we'll come back together. Okay, so you've had a chance to do this. Now, I'm going to start out by saying that this one is also pretty good, just like the last one that you saw. So we didn't give you a bad one, we gave you another good one. There are, we hope you underline, a lot of cases where the teacher went and elicited responses. So you can see every single one of those things that I elicited, that I just wrote, is a different example of eliciting response, including 2 of them here in this section, 2 of them here and 2 of them here. And they come in a variety of formats, and you can see here that one is written, and one is verbal, another verbal one, a gestural one, and a written one, a spoken one, a written one, a written one, a written one, or a spoken one, verbal one, a written one, and finally another gestural one. So there's a wide variety of responses. This is obviously from the same curriculum, and so now you see again here how that's been done really effectively. But again, as we said, that's not going to be true in a lot of cases. Okay, so now we've talked about response formats. Let's talk about matching the response format a little bit more with a curriculum example. So this is actually something from a real curriculum that you might see and you think about what the response format is. So you read the first example here, which you can pause the video and do on your own, also be in your workbook. You can see here the first thing that is asked, the students are asked to do is to have the student push a pencil. So it's obvious there what the response format is, which is students are going to actually push the pencil. Then the teacher asks, why did this thing move? And the student response is, it was pushed. And a lot of curricula will actually specify what students are supposed to do. In this case, push, give the verbal response, and they'll actually specify that. And that's a good thing to do because it makes clear to you that it's a verbal response. And the same thing is true here with the same exact sort of format, right? And so you can see, the teacher sort of fill in the blanks for the teacher to fill in with the object that they actually use. But again, here you can see the response format. I know it seems odd to be talking to you about matching the response format to the instruction you give, but the point here, because it seems obvious, but the point here is that sometimes it's not obvious, and sometimes when we design lessons, we don't think specifically about how we want students to respond. What's the result? They don't respond the way we intend them to. They might put up a thumb rather than saying it or whatever. And so you need to be really clear about that, and these examples show how you can be clear about that. So now let's look at a video example of Mr. Shue. And Mr. Shue here is teaching a first grade geometry lesson. The student's actually a 7th grader, but his IEP goals call for him to be doing work at a first grade level, and he's focusing on shape identification. So let's look at the responses that he elicits from the student. What is the response format that he expects? What instructions does he give, or what questions does he ask to get the response format? So let's watch the video and see.
I will say a shape, and can you point where it is? Okay. So can you show me where is circle? Great. Can you show me where is rectangle? Great. Where is triangle? Great. Where is square? Listen to carefully. Where is triangle? Great. Yes. And now your turn. I will point to the shape, and you tell me what it is. So what's this?
A triangle.
What's this?
A circle.
Great. What's this?
A rectangle.
Rectangle. And what's this?
A square.
Good.
Okay, So you get a really nice sense there. He primarily uses two response formats. One is that he says one and the student points, so that's a gesture response. And then he has the student, he points and the student says something. So he has both response formats there. And it's very clear, there's a clear link. He said, what's this? The student gives the answer. If he wants the student to point, he says the name of it and the student answers. So response format is clear. He's obviously established with the student that if I say something, you point there so the student knows exactly what to do. There's nothing left to the imagination. Obviously, with explicit instruction, a key thing is not making the students guess at it. So we're going to look at this again, and this time we can sort of tally things as we go here and see when the prompts are physical and when the prompts are verbal here. I said gestural, but physical, gestural, same basic idea in this case. So let's go ahead and watch this, and we can see a tally of how many times he uses physical and verbal responses in what is a very short clip.
I will say a shape, and can you point where it is? Okay. So can you show me where is circle? Great. Can you show me where is rectangle? Great. Where is triangle? Great. Where is square? Listen to carefully. Where is triangle? Great. Yes. And now your turn. I will point to the shape, and you tell me what it is. So what's this?
A triangle.
What's this?
A circle.
Great. What's this?
A rectangle.
Rectangle. And what's this?
A square.
Good.
All right, so what a nice example. You can see here there are 5 physical responses and 4 verbal responses in a very short period of time. And as we already said, he's set up the response format for the student. He's made really clear what the expected format is, so the student will give a response that's the one that he expected. So now you're going to get to analyze this video and think of questions or instructions he could have asked or given to elicit responses using a written format. He did not use a written format, but how could he have done that? So look at that video again and think, what might I add to that lesson perhaps? Maybe I continue to do the physical and the verbal responses, but I want to add a written response. What could I do to add that for the student? So that would be a good thing to do. It's what we're going to ask you to do, so we want you to go ahead and do it. And so in your activity workbook, you can analyze that video example, think about those written responses that you might give, and then you can come back and we'll continue on. So I assume at this point you've done the analysis of the video and you've come up with written responses that you might give. And so now we're going to finish up part 4 of this with a discussion board and with a quiz. And so let me talk to you about the discussion board, and then I'll tell you about the quiz, and then eventually I'll give you the answers after you take it, of course. So in terms of discussion board posts here, this is not going to be very complicated, but it's still going to be a worthwhile exercise. So you're going to build a very short lesson. It could be as short as the one that you saw Mr. Shue do, perhaps a little bit longer. And your goal here is to come up with 3 questions you might ask or 3 instructions you might give to elicit the response from the student. You want to include the objective and any other important context information for someone to be able to understand what your lesson is about and sort of where you're headed with it. You can ask all kinds of questions. You can specify that the goal here is to ask a question and so on. All you need to not do is say what the response format is, what you expect students to do as a result. It sounds like a simple exercise, but you might find that when you come up with something, you're not as clear in your own mind about what you intended to do. It might be easy sometimes to distinguish, say, the physical responses and the written verbal responses, but maybe you haven't decided in your own mind, am I going to do a verbal response or a written response? And sometimes, it's happened to me, in the middle of the lesson, I'm like, wait, do I want them to write this? Do I want them to say it? And I'm not clear. So this is a great opportunity to make sure you are clear when you write your questions or write your instructions. And as the person on the other side looking at someone's, you can make sure it's clear to you what they intended as a response format. So that'll be a good exercise for you to do. So go ahead and discussion board post away. And then once you're done with that, we can go on and it'll be time to take the quiz. Okay, so it's time for the quiz. On the quiz, you're going to have a chance to think about how to match the way of listening responses to the learning outcome. I'm going to give you one hint before you start. And I'm not going to tell you what question it's about, but I want to make sure that you get this one right. one thing I want you to think about, and I'm saying this now because I'm not sure how clear we've been about it, is that it's not always necessary to use all kinds of response formats. So you have to think always about what's your lesson objective, and it's possible that for certain objectives, for certain learning outcomes from those objectives, you aren't going to need every kind of response, right? So you don't always have to do a physical response if your lesson objective doesn't call for it. That's a little bit of a hint there. So you can figure out what question that applies to on your own. From that, I'll say, good luck on the quiz.